The silver locket caught the morning light as Delilah Walsh held it up with trembling fingers, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears while desperate townspeople crowded around the makeshift auction table in the dusty street of Tucumcari, New Mexico territory. It was the spring of 1878, and the world had become impossibly cruel since her father died 3 months ago, leaving her with debts she could never hope to repay and creditors who showed no mercy to a 20-year-old woman alone in this harsh land. The auctioneer, a pot-bellied man named Carver who smelled of whiskey and sweat, grabbed items from the table with practiced efficiency, calling out prices while Delilah stood to the side, watching her entire life being sold piece by piece. The furniture from her childhood home had already gone, along with her father's tools, the kitchen supplies her mother had cherished, and now all that remained were personal items, including the locket that had belonged to her mother before consumption had taken her 5 years prior. "Next item," Carver announced, his voice carrying across the crowd of perhaps 40 people who had gathered more for entertainment than genuine interest in buying. "A silver locket, genuine article, belonged to the late Mrs. Walsh. Do I hear 50 cents? Delilah felt her heart crack as someone in the crowd called out the opening bid. She wanted to run forward and snatch it back, to tell them all that some things should not have prices attached, that this small piece of silver held every memory she had of her mother's gentle smile and soft lullabies. But she stood frozen, knowing the debts her father had accumulated at the general store, the feed shop, and the land office had to be paid, or she would end up in jail herself for his failures. 50 cents. Do I hear 75? Carver's voice droned on. 75 cents. A woman near the front called out, her face eager with the thrill of potential ownership. Delilah closed her eyes, unable to watch any more. The sun beat down mercilessly on her dark hair, and she felt sweat trickle down her spine beneath the faded blue dress that had once been her Sunday best. Everything was slipping away like water through desperate fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. $1. A deep male voice called from the back of the crowd, and something in its tone made Delilah open her eyes. She could not see who had spoken from where she stood, but the crowd shifted slightly, people turning to look at whoever had made the bid. Carver's face lit up with renewed interest at the higher price. $1, we have $1 for this fine piece of jewelry. Do I hear more? Carver scanned the crowd hopefully. $1.25, the woman up front countered, unwilling to lose her prize. $2, the male voice came again, firm and final in a way that suggested no further competition would be welcome. The crowd murmured at this, and even Carver looked impressed. $2 was more than the locket was worth by any reasonable measure, and everyone present knew it. The woman up front shook her head and stepped back, clearly unwilling to go higher for what was, after all, just a simple silver locket with some sentimental value to a dead woman and her daughter. $2 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back, Carver announced, banging his small hammer on the table. Come forward and claim your purchase, sir. The crowd parted, and Delilah finally saw the man who had bought her most precious possession. He was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical work and a lean build that suggested he spent more time in the saddle than anywhere else. His hair was dark brown, almost black, visible beneath a worn leather hat that had seen better days. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty boots, dark trousers, a shirt that might once have been white but had faded to gray, and a vest that had been patched more than once. A gun belt sat low on his hips, but the holster looked well used rather than ornamental, marking him as someone who lived the life rather than play acted at it. As he approached the table, Delilah caught sight of his face. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 24 or 25, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble and eyes of such a striking blue-green color. They seemed almost unreal in his sun-weathered face. There was something in those eyes, a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his rough appearance, that made her breath catch slightly. He paid Carver the $2 in coins counted out carefully from a worn leather pouch, then accepted the locket with surprising delicacy, holding it in his large, calloused hands as though it were something precious, rather than just another trinket won at an auction. For a moment, he stood there looking at it, and then he lifted his gaze directly to where Delilah stood. Their eyes met across the dusty space, and something passed between them, some wordless communication that Delilah could not name but felt all the way to her core. Then he nodded to her just once, tipped his hat in a gesture of respect, and walked away through the crowd before she could even think to speak to him. The auction continued, but Delilah barely registered it. The remaining items were few and of little value. Some old books, a few pieces of costume jewelry, a chipped wash basin. Together they brought in another $1.40, which Carver added to the pile of money on the table. When everything was sold, he counted it all out methodically while Delilah waited, her stomach churning with anxiety. "Total comes to $18.90, Carver announced. "Your father owed $23.15 total across all his creditors. You are still short $4.25, Miss Walsh." Delilah felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She had known it would be close, but she had hoped, prayed even, that somehow it would be enough. "I do not have anything else," she said quietly, hating how defeated her voice sounded. "Everything is gone." Carver shrugged, clearly unbothered by her distress. "Then you will have to find another way to make up the difference. The creditors have been patient, but they want their money." "You have until the end of the week, Miss Walsh, or Sheriff Morton will have to get involved, and nobody wants that." The threat hung in the air between them. Everyone knew what happened to people who could not pay their debts. At best, she would be forced into indentured servitude until the debt was worked off. At worst, she would be thrown in jail, and young women in jail rarely emerged with their reputations or their health intact. "I understand," Delilah managed to say, though her throat felt tight and her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed in front of all these people who had just picked over her life like vultures. Carver handed her the money minus his 10% commission for conducting the sale, and then the crowd began to disperse, people drifting away now that the entertainment was over. Delilah stood alone in the street, clutching the money to her chest, and trying to figure out what she could possibly do to earn $4.25 in less than a week. Tucumcari was not a large town, but it sat along a major route for cattle drives heading north, which meant there was usually work available for men willing to do hard labor. For women, the options were far more limited. She could cook or clean or sew, but most families did their own such work, and the few businesses in town that might hire her were already staffed. The saloon would pay her, she knew, but the thought of what would be expected from a saloon girl made her stomach turn. Her mother had raised her with firm values, and Delilah would rather risk jail than betray those principles. She walked slowly back toward the boarding house where she had been staying since her father's death and the loss of their small homestead. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor, had been kind enough to let her stay on credit for the past 2 weeks, but that debt would come due soon as well. Everything seemed to be crashing down at once, an avalanche of troubles that left Delilah feeling buried and breathless. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had been painted white at some point in the distant past, but now looked more gray than anything else. Delilah climbed the steps to the front porch, pushed open the door, and immediately encountered Mrs. Patterson in the front hall. The older woman, probably in her late 50s with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun, looked up from the ledger she had been reviewing. "I saw you coming from the auction," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice neutral. "I assume things did not go as well as hoped." "Not quite enough," Delilah admitted. "I am still short about $4. Mrs. Patterson sighed. "And you owe me $3 for the 2 weeks' room and board. I hate to press you, dear, but I cannot run a charity. I have my own bills to pay." "I know," Delilah said quickly. "I will find a way. I just need a little more time." "End of the week," Mrs. Patterson said, not unkindly but firmly. "I can give you until then, but no longer. I am sorry, Delilah. You seem like a good girl, and what happened to your father was a tragedy, but business is business." Delilah nodded and climbed the stairs to her small room on the second floor. It was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, with one small window that looked out over the street. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Great heaving sobs that she muffled with her pillow so that the other boarders would not hear. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollow and exhausted. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, watching the patterns the afternoon light made through the window. Somewhere in this town, a cowboy with blue-green eyes had her mother's locket, the last tangible connection she had to the woman who had given her life. The loss of it hurt almost as much as the financial ruin, and Delilah wondered if she would ever stop feeling like everything precious was being stripped away from her. Sleep eventually claimed her, a fitful rest filled with anxious dreams of being chased and falling and losing her way in endless dark corridors. When she woke, the light outside had shifted to the golden tones of late afternoon, and she realized she had slept for several hours. Her head ached and her eyes felt swollen, but she forced herself to sit up and splash water on her face from the wash basin. She needed to pull herself together and figure out a plan. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. That evening, Delilah walked to the general store to speak with Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, who had been the largest of her father's creditors. The store smelled of leather and tobacco, and the faint sweetness of penny candy kept in jars on the counter. Henderson was a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers from keeping his careful records. "Miss Walsh," he greeted her when she entered, his tone cautious. "I heard about the auction." "Yes, sir," Delilah said, standing as straight as she could manage. "I came to ask if there might be any work I could do to make up the difference in what I owe you. I can clean or organize stock or do bookkeeping if you need it. I learned my letters and numbers well at the school, and I am a hard worker." Henderson looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, but he shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Walsh, but my wife handles all the cleaning and organizing, and I do my own books. Even if I did have work, I could not pay you enough to make up $4 in less than a week. I am sorry." Delilah swallowed her disappointment. "I understand. Thank you anyway." She left the store and walked aimlessly through the town as evening settled over Tucumcari. Oil lamps were being lit in windows, casting warm glows that made the buildings look more welcoming than they felt. From the saloon came the tinny sound of a piano and the occasional burst of male laughter. The church at the end of the main street stood dark and silent, its white steeple pointing accusingly at the sky. Without really planning to, Delilah found herself walking toward the edge of town, where the cattle pens and stables were located. This was where the cowboys stayed when they brought herds through, and where men who made their living in the saddle tended to gather. It was not a proper place for a respectable young woman to wander alone, but Delilah was too tired and heartsick to care much about propriety at the moment. The stables were large wooden structures that smelled of hay and horses and leather. Lanterns hung at intervals, creating pools of light in the growing darkness. She could see several horses in the corral, and a few men sitting on the fence or standing around talking in low voices. None of them paid her any attention as she walked slowly past, looking without really knowing what she was looking for. Then she saw him. The cowboy who had bought her locket was standing near one of the stable doors, brushing down a large bay horse with patient, methodical strokes. He had removed his vest and hat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms tanned dark by the sun and corded with lean muscle. He was talking quietly to the horse as he worked, his voice too low for Delilah to make out the words but the tone gentle and soothing. She stopped walking and simply watched him for a moment, this stranger who had paid far too much for a locket that meant nothing to him. Why had he done it? Had he simply liked the look of it, or had he seen something in her face during the auction that had moved him to kindness? She wanted to know, and more than that, she wanted to see her mother's locket one more time, even if it no longer belonged to her. Before she could talk herself out of it, Delilah walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the packed dirt. The horse saw her first, lifting its head and nickering softly. The cowboy turned, his hand automatically moving toward his gun before he recognized her and relaxed. "Miss Walsh," he said, and she was struck again by how deep his voice was, like distant thunder on a summer afternoon. "I did not expect to see you here. You know my name," Delilah said, somewhat surprised. "Small town," he replied with a slight shrug. "Hard not to hear things, and I saw the auction announcement had your name on it." He paused, then added, "My name is Nathan Kincaid. Most folks just call me Nate." "Mr. Kincaid," Delilah said formally, then hesitated, not quite sure how to explain why she had sought him out. "I wanted to thank you for buying the locket. You paid more than it was worth." Nathan set down the brush and leaned against the stable wall, crossing his arms over his chest as he looked at her. In the lantern light, his eyes seemed more green than blue, and there was an intelligence in them that belied his rough appearance. "It was worth what I paid for it," he said simply. "Seemed like it meant something to you." Delilah felt her throat tighten at this casual observation. "It was my mother's. She died 5 years ago, and it was all I had left of her. Well, until today." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow did not. Then he said, "Your father was Thomas Walsh, the one who had the homestead about 5 miles east of here." "Yes," Delilah confirmed, wondering how much he knew about her family's troubles. "I heard he died back in February. Heard it was unexpected and that he left debts behind. Rough situation for you to be in." There was no judgment in his voice, only a kind of matter-of-fact sympathy that made Delilah feel simultaneously grateful and exposed. "Very rough," she agreed quietly. "The auction did not raise quite enough to cover everything. I still owe over $4 and I have no way to earn it." She had not meant to tell him that. The words had simply spilled out, pulled by something in his steady regard that made her feel safe enough to be honest. As soon as she said it, she felt embarrassed, like she was begging for charity from a stranger. But Nathan did not look at her with pity or condescension. Instead, he uncrossed his arms and straightened up, his expression thoughtful. $4 is a fair amount of money," he said. "What happens if you cannot pay it?" "Sheriff Morton gets involved," Delilah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Best case, I work it off somehow. Worst case, jail." Nathan's jaw tightened slightly at this, a muscle jumping beneath his stubble. "That is not right," he said quietly, "punishing a woman for her dead father's debts." "Right or not, it is the law," Delilah said with a bitter laugh. and the law does not care much about what is fair, in my experience." Nathan was quiet again, and Delilah got the sense he was thinking hard about something. Finally, he said, "I might know of work if you are interested and do not mind hard labor." Hope flared in Delilah's chest, so bright and sudden it almost hurt. "What kind of work?" "The ranch where I work, the Triple K about 10 miles north of here, belongs to a man named Charles Kincaid. He is my uncle, took me in when I was a kid after my parents died. Right now we are short-handed because 2 of the men quit to go try their luck at gold mining in Colorado, and we are coming into branding season. Uncle Charles mentioned needing help with the cooking and cleaning for the bunkhouse. The regular cook, old Pedro, is getting on in years and could use an assistant." Delilah's mind raced. Ranch work was respectable, unlike the saloon, and cooking and cleaning were things she knew how to do. But living on a ranch surrounded by cowboys was a different proposition entirely from boarding in town. Her reputation could suffer, though she supposed her reputation would suffer far more from jail. "How much would the work pay?" she asked, trying to be practical. "Room and board plus about $2 a week," Nathan said. "It is hard work, sunrise to sunset most days, but it is honest. And Uncle Charles is a good man. He would make sure you were treated properly. $2 a week." It would take her at least 3 weeks to earn enough to pay off all her debts at that rate. Maybe 4 if she factored in what she still owed Mrs. Patterson. But it was better than any other option she had, and the fact that Nathan was vouching for his uncle made her feel like it might actually be legitimate work and not some kind of trap. "Why are you helping me?" Delilah asked, the question coming out more bluntly than she had intended. "You do not know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook or a lazy worker." Nathan smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and somehow even more handsome. "Call it a gut feeling," he said. "I watched you during that auction, standing there trying not to cry while strangers picked through your whole life. You have got pride and courage, and that counts for a lot in my book. Besides, Uncle Charles really does need help, so you would be doing me a favor too." Delilah wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that this stroke of luck was real and not just another disappointment waiting to happen. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit or hidden motives, but all she saw was honest concern and a straightforward offer of help. "When would I start?" she asked. "Could take you out there tomorrow morning if you want," Nathan said. "I am heading back at first light. You can meet Uncle Charles and Pedro, see the setup, and decide if it suits you. No obligation until you agree to take the job." It was more than fair. It was generous, actually, and Delilah felt something loosen in her chest, the first real relief she had felt in months. "All right," she said. "I accept. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, truly." "Nate," he corrected gently. "If we are going to be working together, might as well use given names." "And you are welcome, Delilah. I hope it works out for both of us." The sound of her name in his deep voice did something strange to Delilah's insides, a little flutter that she tried to ignore. He was helping her out of kindness, nothing more, and she could not afford to read anything else into it. Besides, he was probably already courting someone. A man who looked like he did and had a steady job probably had his pick of interested women. They arranged to meet at the stables just after dawn, and then Delilah walked back to the boarding house feeling lighter than she had in months. She had a plan now, a way forward, and it was all thanks to a cowboy with kind eyes who had paid too much for a locket at an auction. That night, she slept better than she had since her father died. The next morning, Delilah woke before dawn and packed her few belongings into a worn carpetbag that had belonged to her mother. She did not have much: 3 dresses, some undergarments, a nightgown, her hairbrush, and the small Bible her mother had given her for her confirmation. Everything she owned in the world fit into one bag, a sobering reality that she tried not to dwell on. She left a note for Mrs. Patterson explaining where she was going and promising to send the money she owed as soon as she earned it. Then she walked through the quiet streets of Tucumcari as the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, painting the horizon in shades of deep purple and gold. Nathan was already at the stables when she arrived, checking the saddle on his bay horse and the pack on a second, smaller mare. He looked up when he heard her approach and nodded in greeting. "Morning," he said. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a while," Delilah admitted. "Thank you again for this opportunity." "Let us see if you still thank me after a week of Pedro's grumbling and bunkhouse cooking," Nathan said with a slight smile. "The man is a perfectionist when it comes to his kitchen." He helped her tie her carpet bag to the pack mare's saddle, then looked at her assessingly. "Have you ridden much?" "Some," Delilah said. "My father had an old plow horse I used to ride sometimes, though not in the past year or so." "This mare is gentle," Nathan assured her. "Her name is Daisy, and she knows the route to the ranch by heart. Just sit easy, and she will follow along behind my horse without much direction needed." He helped Delilah mount, his hands firm and respectful as he steadied her, and then he swung up onto his own horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. They rode out of town as the sun crested the horizon, flooding the landscape with golden light. The New Mexico territory in spring was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The land stretched out in rolling plains covered in scrub grass and sage, punctuated by red rock formations that rose like ancient monuments against the sky. In the distance, mountains created a purple barrier on the horizon. The air was cool in the early morning but already held the promise of heat to come. Nathan set an easy pace, mindful of Delilah's lack of recent riding experience. And true to his word, Daisy followed along placidly behind his bay. For a while they rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic plodding of hooves and the occasional call of a bird. Delilah found herself relaxing into the movement, letting the morning peace wash over her. After about half an hour, Nathan glanced back at her and asked, "Are you doing all right? We can stop and rest if you need to." "I am fine," Delilah assured him. "It feels good to be out of town, actually. Tucumcari has not held many happy memories for me lately." "I can imagine," Nathan said. "Where are you from originally?" "I do not recall your family being here more than a few years." "Kansas," Delilah told him. "My father had a farm there, but after my mother died, he wanted a fresh start. We came out here about 3 years ago and tried to make a go of homesteading, but it was harder than he expected. The land was difficult, and he did not have much experience with cattle. He kept thinking the next season would be better, and he took on debt to make it through each year. Then last winter he caught pneumonia, and that was the end of it." She said it flatly, trying to keep the emotion out of her voice, but Nathan must have heard something anyway because his expression softened. "I am sorry you lost both your parents so young. That is a hard thing to carry." "You said your parents died when you were young too," Delilah ventured, curious about the man who had so unexpectedly changed her fortunes. Nathan nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "I was 9. We were traveling from Texas to Montana, hoping to start fresh after the war. War between the states left a lot of damage in its wake, and my father wanted to leave all that behind. But we ran into trouble with bandits on the trail. My parents were killed, and I ended up alone until a cavalry patrol found me and brought me to the nearest town. That happened to be where my Uncle Charles was living, and he took me in without hesitation, raised me like I was his own son." "That was good of him," Delilah said softly, trying to imagine a 9-year-old boy watching his parents die, and then being forced to navigate a harsh world alone. "He is a good man," Nathan agreed. "Tough but fair, and he taught me everything I know about ranching and horses and how to be decent in a world that does not always reward decency. I owe him more than I could ever repay." They rode on, and as the morning progressed, Nathan pointed out various landmarks and told her about the area. He showed her where a box canyon provided shelter for cattle during bad weather, where the best water sources were located, and where to watch out for rattlesnakes that liked to sun themselves on rocks. He was a good teacher, patient and thorough, and Delilah found herself listening intently, storing away information that might prove useful. Around mid-morning they crested a rise and Nathan pointed ahead. "There is the Triple K," he said, and Delilah could hear the pride in his voice. The ranch spread out below them in a valley sheltered by low hills. The main house was a sturdy structure built of adobe and wood, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Nearby stood a large barn, several corrals, and a long bunkhouse. She could see cattle grazing in the distance and what looked like a vegetable garden near the main house. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, suggesting someone was already up and cooking breakfast. As they rode down toward the ranch, several dogs ran out to greet them, barking enthusiastically but with tails wagging to show they were friendly rather than threatening. Nathan called to them by name, Rusty and Me and Buck, and they circled around the horses with obvious delight at his return. An older man emerged from the main house as they approached. He was probably in his late 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent under the sun. He was tall like Nathan, with the same broad shoulders, and Delilah could see the family resemblance immediately. "Nathan," the man called out in greeting, "was not expecting you back quite this early. Who is your companion?" Nathan dismounted and helped Delilah down from Daisy, then turned to his uncle. "Uncle Charles, this is Miss Delilah Walsh. I told you about the situation in town, with Thomas Walsh's daughter being left with all his debts. Well, this is her, and I thought she might be the answer to your cook problem." Charles Kincaid looked at Delilah with shrewd but not unkind eyes, taking in her worn dress and the carpet-bag tied to Daisy's saddle. "Miss Walsh," he said with a polite nod, "I am sorry for your loss. Your father was a hard-working man from what I heard, just had some bad luck with the land." "Thank you, sir," Delilah said, appreciating that he spoke respectfully of her father rather than criticizing his debts. "Nathan told me you might have work available. I can cook and clean, and I am willing to work hard. Are you now?" Charles said, but there was a hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "Well, let us go see what Pedro thinks. He is the one who would be working with you most directly, and his opinion carries weight in his kitchen." They walked toward the bunkhouse, Nathan leading the horses to be unsaddled later. The interior of the bunkhouse was long and narrow, with bunks lining both walls and a large open area at one end that served as the kitchen and dining space. A wood stove dominated the kitchen, and standing in front of it, stirring something in a large pot, was an elderly Mexican man with white hair and a deeply lined face. "Pedro," Charles called out, "come meet someone." Pedro turned, his dark eyes sharp despite his age, and looked Delilah up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who did not suffer fools gladly. "Who is this?" he asked, his English heavily accented but clear. "This is Miss Delilah Walsh," Charles said. "Nathan brought her out as a potential assistant for you. Says she can cook and clean and is willing to work hard. What do you think? Can you use the help?" Pedro wiped his hands on his apron and walked closer, circling Delilah slowly while she stood still and tried not to feel like livestock being evaluated. Finally, he stopped in front of her and asked bluntly, "Can you make bread?" "Yes, sir," Delilah said. "My mother taught me. I can make biscuits, cornbread, sourdough loaves. Can you cook beans without burning them?" "Yes, sir." "Can you butcher a chicken?" "Yes, sir, and pluck it and clean it properly." Pedro grunted, which might have been approval. "Can you take orders and follow them exactly, without thinking you know better?" This seemed like a test of character rather than skill. Delilah met his eyes steadily and said, "I can, sir. I am here to learn from you and help however you need me to, not to come in thinking I know everything." For the first time, Pedro smiled, just a slight upturn of his lips. "Good answer. Too many young people think they know everything these days." He turned to Charles. "I will try her for a week. If she works out, she can stay. If not, she goes." "Fair enough," Charles agreed. He looked at Delilah. "The work is hard and the hours are long. You will be up before dawn to start breakfast for the men, and you will not be done cleaning up from supper until well after dark most days. The pay is room and board plus $2 a week, paid every Saturday. You will sleep in the small room off the kitchen, which is not fancy but it is private and it locks from the inside. The men know better than to bother you, but if anyone does, you tell me or Nathan immediately and it will be dealt with. Are those terms acceptable?" It was more than acceptable. It was a lifeline. "Yes, sir," Delilah said. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will not let you down." "See that you do not," Charles said, but his tone was kind. "Nathan, help her get settled. Pedro, teach her your routine so she can start being useful tomorrow morning." Over the next few hours, Delilah was introduced to the rhythm of ranch life. Pedro showed her around the kitchen with the proprietary air of a general showing off his army, explaining where everything was kept and how he liked things organized. He was exacting in his standards but patient in his teaching, and Delilah found herself liking the gruff old man despite his stern demeanor. The room she would be sleeping in was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a small trunk, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains and, as Charles had promised, a sturdy lock on the door. After months of feeling unsafe and uncertain, the simple ability to lock her door and sleep without fear felt like an unbelievable luxury. That afternoon, Pedro set her to work peeling potatoes for supper while he prepared beef stew. As she worked, cowboys drifted in and out of the bunkhouse, some curious about the new arrival, others too tired from a day's work to care much. Nathan introduced her to those who came by, a rotating cast of young men with sun-weathered faces and calloused hands who treated her with a kind of courteous distance, as though unsure how to interact with a respectable woman in their space. Supper that evening was a communal affair, with about 15 men crowding around the long table to eat. The food was simple but plentiful: stew, bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Delilah helped Pedro serve, and then ate her own meal in the kitchen, while the men talked and joked at the table. She could feel eyes on her occasionally, but whenever she looked up, Nathan was there. His presence somehow protective even though he sat with the other men and did not single her out for any special attention. After supper came the massive job of cleaning up, washing dishes for 17 people in water heated on the stove. Delilah's hands were red and sore by the time she finished, and her back ached from standing, but she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was honest work, hard but meaningful, and for the first time in months she felt like she had some control over her future. Pedro inspected her work with a critical eye, then nodded approval. "You will do," he said simply. "Go rest. Tomorrow we start at 4 in the morning." Delilah retreated to her tiny room and collapsed onto the cot, too tired even to properly undress. She fell asleep almost immediately, Her last thought a prayer of gratitude for Cowboy with blue-green eyes who had bought a locket and changed her life. The days fell into a demanding but satisfying rhythm. Delilah woke before dawn each morning to help Pedro prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy, and endless pots of coffee. Then came the cleaning, the preparation for the midday meal, more cleaning, and then supper preparations that lasted well into the evening. Her hands grew rough and her body ached, but she also felt herself growing stronger, more capable. Pedro was a demanding teacher but a fair one, and Delilah learned quickly that his gruffness hid a kind heart. When she accidentally burned a batch of biscuits during her first week, he simply shrugged and said, "Even the best cook burns bread sometimes. The chickens will eat them. Try again." And when she successfully made a peach cobbler that the men devoured with enthusiastic praise, Pedro's eyes crinkled with pride as though she were his own daughter. Charles Kincaid proved to be as fair as Nathan had promised. He checked in regularly to make sure she was settling in well and treated her with unfailing respect. He paid her wages on time every Saturday, counting out the coins into her palm and marking it in his ledger with careful precision. But it was Nathan who occupied more and more of Delilah's thoughts as the weeks passed. He was always around the ranch, working with the horses, or helping with the cattle or fixing fences that had been damaged over the winter. She saw him often throughout the day, and he always greeted her with a smile and a friendly word. Sometimes he would linger in the kitchen after meals, ostensibly helping to clear plates but really just talking with her while she worked. She learned that he was 24, just as she had guessed, and that he had never left New Mexico territory since his uncle took him in 15 years ago. He loved horses with a passion that made his whole face light up when he talked about them, and he had a gift for training even the most difficult animals. He read books whenever he could get his hands on them, an unusual trait for a cowboy, and he had opinions on everything from politics to poetry that surprised her with their depth and thoughtfulness. For his part, Nathan seemed to seek out her company whenever possible. He taught her to ride properly, taking time on Sunday afternoons when work was lighter to show her how to control a horse with subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure, rather than harsh yanking on the reins. He brought her wildflowers once, a handful of yellow blooms that he claimed he had just stumbled across, though the look in his eyes suggested he had actually searched them out specifically for her. Delilah tried not to read too much into these gestures. Nathan was a kind man helping someone he had pulled from desperate circumstances, nothing more. But she could not deny the way her heart sped up whenever he entered a room, or the way she found herself listening for his voice among all the other cowboys, or the way she treasured every conversation they had, turning his words over in her mind later when she was alone. 2 months passed, then 3. Summer arrived in full force, bringing heat that made the kitchen work almost unbearable and turned the landscape brown except where careful irrigation kept things green. Delilah's debts were paid off completely by mid-June, the last dollars sent to Mrs. Patterson with a note of thanks for her earlier patience. It was a profound relief to no longer owe anyone anything, to have her wages be fully her own to save or spend as she chose. She chose to save most of it, tucking the coins into a small leather pouch she kept hidden in her trunk. She was not sure what she was saving for exactly, just some vague notion of security, of never again being in the desperate position she had been in during that auction. But having money of her own, earned by her own labor, felt powerful in a way she had never experienced before. One evening in late July, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, and most of the men had drifted outside to escape the heat of the bunkhouse, Nathan found Delilah sitting on the front steps, looking at the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and deep purple, so vivid it almost hurt to look at. "Mind if I sit?" Nathan asked, and Delilah nodded, suddenly nervous in a way she could not quite name. He settled beside her on the step, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him but not quite touching. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, watching the colors deepen and shift as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Then Nathan said quietly, "I have something that belongs to you." Delilah looked at him questioningly, and he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out her mother's locket. It glinted in the dying light, the silver catching the last rays of sun, and Delilah's breath caught in her throat. "I've been carrying this around for months now," Nathan said, holding it carefully. "Kept meaning to give it back to you, but the time never seemed right somehow. But I think maybe tonight is the right time." "I do not understand," Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You bought it. It belongs to you now." "No," Nathan said firmly. "It never belonged to me. I bought it to keep it safe for you until you were in a position to have it back. I saw your face during that auction, Delilah. I saw how much losing this hurt you. And I had some money saved up, so I figured I could at least spare you that one loss, even if I could not fix everything else that was wrong." Tears welled up in Delilah's eyes as the full impact of what he was saying hit her. He had spent $2, a significant sum, not because he wanted the locket for himself but because he had wanted to save it for her. He had done it for a stranger, motivated by nothing but compassion for her pain. "Nathan," she breathed, hardly knowing what to say. "That is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." He smiled, that transformative expression that made her heart flip over in her chest, and held the locket out to her. "Then you have been around too many unkind people. Here, take it. It should be with you." Delilah took the locket with trembling hands and immediately opened it. Inside were the two tiny photographs she remembered. One of her mother as a young woman, beautiful and serious in her wedding dress, and one of her father before illness and hardship had carved lines into his face. Her family, gone now but preserved forever in these small images. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the locket to her chest. "Thank you so much." "You are welcome," Nathan said softly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "I have to confess something. I did not just buy that locket to be kind. I mean, that was part of it, but not all of it." Delilah looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Nathan rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking uncomfortable in a way she had never seen before. "I saw you standing there at that auction, looking so brave and heartbroken at the same time, and something just hit me right in the chest. I knew I had to help you somehow, had to figure out a way to make things even a little bit better. And then when I talked to you at the stables that night, I knew I wanted to know you better, wanted to spend time with you. So yes, I bought the locket to save it for you, but I also brought you out here to the ranch partly because I wanted you close by. Is that terribly selfish of me?" Delilah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "You wanted to spend time with me," she repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Nathan said simply, turning to look directly at her. "I have wanted that from the first moment I saw you, if I am being completely honest. These past 3 months having you here have been the best months I can remember in a long time, and it is not just because Pedro's cooking has improved with your help." He smiled slightly at his own weak joke, then grew serious again. "I know I am probably speaking out of turn. You have been through so much, and the last thing you need is some cowboy complicating your life when you are just getting back on your feet. But I could not give you back the locket without telling you the truth about why I bought it in the first place." Delilah felt like her whole world had tilted sideways. All these weeks she had been trying to convince herself that Nathan was just being kind, that she should not read anything into his attention. And now he was telling her that he had felt the same pull she had from the very beginning. "You are not complicating anything," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. "Nathan, I have thought about you every day since that auction. When I saw you by the locket, something in me just knew you were someone special, someone different. And then you gave me this job, and you have been so kind and patient, teaching me to ride and bringing me flowers and just talking to me like I am someone worth knowing. I tried not to hope for too much, but I have been hoping anyway." Nathan's face lit up with such joy that it took her breath away. "You have?" he asked, as though he could hardly believe it. "Yes," Delilah said, laughing a little through the tears that were now streaming down her face. "Yes, I have been hoping very much. Can I court you properly then?" Nathan asked, reaching out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Can I take you on walks and bring you more flowers and generally make a nuisance of myself trying to win your affection?" "You do not have to win what you already have," Delilah said softly. And then Nathan was leaning in and kissing her, gentle and sweet and filled with a promise of all the good things that might lie ahead. They sat on those steps as the last light faded from the sky, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing, making plans and promises. Nathan told her that he was slowly saving money to buy his own land someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses. Delilah told him about her dreams of having a real home again, a place that belonged to her and could never be taken away. They found that their hopes aligned in ways that felt almost magical, as though they had been meant to find each other all along. The courtship that followed was both proper and passionate in the way of two people who had found something rare and precious. Nathan asked Charles's permission to court Delilah formally, and Charles gave his blessing with a knowing smile that suggested he had seen this coming from the day Nathan brought her to the ranch. Pedro grumbled about young people and romance, but could be seen hiding his own pleased smiles when he thought no one was looking. Nathan courted Delilah with a steady devotion that made her feel cherished in ways she had never experienced before. He took her on long rides through the countryside on Sunday afternoons, showing her hidden valleys and clear streams where they could sit and talk for hours. He taught her about the land and the animals and the sky, sharing his deep knowledge with patience and obvious pleasure in her interest. For her part, Delilah found herself falling more deeply in love with every passing day. Nathan was good in ways that went bone deep, honest, hardworking, gentle with animals and children, respectful to everyone regardless of their station. But he was also funny and thoughtful and surprisingly romantic, leaving little notes for her to find when he knew she would be alone in the kitchen, or carving her a small wooden horse that she treasured more than gold. By late autumn, when the heat finally broke and the air turned cool and crisp, they both knew where this was heading. Nathan asked her to marry him on a Sunday in November, taking her to a high ridge that overlooked the valley where the ranch sat. He did not have a ring yet, he explained apologetically, but he had love and a commitment to work hard and make a good life for them, if she would have him. Delilah said yes before he could even finish his question, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him with all the love that had been building in her heart for months. They stayed on that ridge until sunset, making plans and dreaming dreams. Two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and hardship and had chosen to build something beautiful together. They set the wedding date for January, wanting to wait until after the busy holiday season, but not wanting to wait too much longer than necessary. Nathan used his saved money to buy a small plot of land adjacent to the Triple K Ranch, 20 acres with good water and enough pasture for a starter herd of horses. Charles sold him a dozen young horses at a generous price, and promised to help him build a house come spring. Delilah continued working for Pedro, but spent her free time sewing a wedding dress from fabric Nathan bought for her in Tucumcari. It was pale blue, the color of a summer sky, because wearing white seemed dishonest for a second marriage to the land if not to a person, and she wanted to start her marriage to Nathan with honesty in all things. The night before the wedding, as Delilah lay in her narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen, she took out her mother's locket and opened it, looking at the familiar faces inside. "I wish you could be here," she whispered to the photographs. "I wish you could meet Nathan and see how happy he makes me. But I think maybe you had something to do with this somehow. I think maybe you were watching out for me even when I thought I was completely alone." The wedding took place on a clear January afternoon in 1879, in the small church in Tucumcari, where Delilah's father was buried in the cemetery out back. The guest list was small. Charles Kincaid standing as Nathan's best man, Pedro and some of the ranch hands, a few townspeople who had been kind to Delilah during her difficulties, and Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house who had forgiven the delayed payment and had become something of a friend. Delilah wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Nathan had gathered and preserved for her. She felt beautiful and nervous, and happier than she had ever imagined possible, as she walked down the short aisle of the church toward where Nathan waited, looking uncomfortable in a suit borrowed from his uncle, but with eyes that shone with love and pride. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Cooper who had been preaching in Tucumcari for 20 years, led them through the vows. Delilah's voice shook slightly as she promised to love and honor Nathan for all her days, but Nathan's voice was steady and strong as he made the same promises back to her. And then, just before Reverend Cooper pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Delilah gasped as she saw what it was: her mother's locket, now attached to a delicate new silver chain. "I want you to wear this today," Nathan said softly, just for her ears. "I want your mother to be part of this day, even though she cannot be here in person. And I want you to remember that from the first moment I saw you, I knew you were someone extraordinary. I bought this locket because I could not stand to see you lose everything. And now I am giving it back to you on our wedding day because I want you to know that nothing will ever be taken from you again. Not while I am alive to prevent it." Tears streamed down Delilah's face as Nathan gently fastened the locket around her neck. She could feel the weight of it against her chest, over her heart, and it felt like a blessing and a promise all at once. "I love you," she whispered, not caring that everyone could hear. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Nathan replied, and then he was kissing her while the small congregation applauded and cheered. The reception was held at the ranch, in the main house where Charles had insisted they celebrate. There was food and music and dancing, and Delilah laughed more than she had in years, swept around the room in Nathan's arms while Pedro played a fiddle with surprising skill, and the ranch hands clapped along to the rhythm. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Delilah stepped outside for a moment of air and found herself looking up at the stars scattered across the vast New Mexico sky. She touched the locket at her throat and thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. Her parents' deaths, the debts, the auction, and a cowboy with kind eyes who had paid too much for a piece of silver that meant everything. Nathan found her there a few minutes later, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best ones," Delilah said, leaning into his warmth. "If my father had not died, if I had not been forced to sell everything, if you had not been in town that day and seen the auction, we never would have met. and I cannot imagine my life without you now." "I was thinking the same thing," Nathan admitted. "I almost did not go into town that week. I needed some supplies, but I was thinking about waiting another few days. But something made me go, some feeling I could not shake, and then I saw you standing there, and I knew exactly why I had been drawn to town that particular day. Some things are just meant to be, I think." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other and looking at the stars. Two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances and had chosen to build a life together despite all the hardships the world had thrown at them. Their first year of marriage was not easy, but it was good. They lived in a small cabin on the Triple K Ranch while Nathan worked on building their house on the adjacent land. Delilah continued helping Pedro part-time, now as a paid employee rather than living in the bunkhouse, and she also began taking in sewing work from townspeople to earn extra money. Nathan threw himself into horse training with single-minded focus, determined to build a reputation and a business that would support them. He had a gift for working with difficult horses, a patience and understanding that allowed him to reach animals other trainers had given up on. Word spread, and soon people were bringing him horses from all over the territory, paying good money for his skills. By the spring of 1880, their house was finished. A modest two-room structure with a porch and a good well and windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was not fancy, but it was theirs, built with Nathan's hands and Delilah's dreams, and the day they moved in felt like a coronation of sorts, the official beginning of their life together on their own land. That same spring, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathan on a Sunday morning as they sat on their new porch drinking coffee and watching the sun rise, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy and excitement tempered with protective concern for her health. The pregnancy was not easy. Delilah suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and later from swelling in her feet and hands that made work difficult. But Nathan was attentive and caring, taking over household tasks when she was too tired, rubbing her feet in the evenings, and talking to her growing belly with such love and anticipation that it made Delilah fall in love with him all over again. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Delilah's father, was born on a cold night in December 1880. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town, and with Nathan pacing outside in a state of barely controlled panic. But when it was over and Delilah held her son for the first time, looking at his tiny, perfect face, she felt a completeness she had not known she had been missing. Nathan cried when he held Thomas for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son with wonder and promised quietly that he would always protect him, always love him, always be the kind of father who stayed. They settled into parenthood with the exhausted joy common to all new parents. Thomas was a fussy baby who did not sleep well and seemed to need constant attention. But he was also alert and strong and beautiful, and neither Delilah nor Nathan minded the sleepless nights when they meant holding this precious life they had created together. Charles Kincaid was a doting grandfather figure, coming by often to hold the baby and offer unsolicited advice that was usually actually quite helpful. Pedro carved small wooden toys for Thomas and pretended to be annoyed when Delilah brought the baby to the ranch kitchen. But she always caught him making faces to make Thomas smile when he thought no one was watching. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the horse training business continued to expand. Nathan took on a part-time assistant, a young man named James who had a way with horses and was eager to learn. This allowed Nathan to take on more clients and also to spend more time with his family, a balance he valued deeply. In 1882, Delilah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Nathan's mother. Sarah was a calmer baby than Thomas had been, content to sleep and eat and observe the world with solemn blue eyes that reminded Delilah so much of Nathan. It made her heart ache with love. With two young children and a growing business, life was busy and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying. Delilah and Nathan had built something real and lasting, a family and a home and a livelihood that was all theirs. They worked hard and loved harder, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating each success together. One evening in the summer of 1883, after the children were asleep and the dishes were washed and the horses were fed and settled for the night, Delilah and Nathan sat on their porch watching the sunset in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. "Do you ever think about that auction?" Nathan asked suddenly. "About how close we came to never meeting?" "Sometimes," Delilah admitted. "It was the worst day of my life in so many ways, but it was also the beginning of everything good that has happened since. Strange how that works." "I am glad I went to town that day," Nathan said softly. "I am glad I saw you and had the sense to at least try to help. You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me." "You saved me," Delilah said, reaching over to take his hand. "In every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me work and dignity and respect, and then you gave me love and a family and a home. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you bought that locket." Nathan brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I would do it again in a heartbeat. I would buy 1,000 lockets if it meant finding you." They sat together as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, two people who had started with nothing but each other and had built a life full of love and meaning. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and secure in the home their parents had created. And around Delilah's neck, glinting in the last light of day, hung a silver locket that had been sold and returned and had witnessed the beginning of a love story that would last the rest of their lives. Years continued to pass in the measured rhythm of ranch life, seasons turning, children growing, horses trained and sold and trained again. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books and learning, much like his father. Sarah was more adventurous, always climbing trees and trying to ride horses before she was really old enough. In 1885, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Charles after Nathan's uncle, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep the previous winter. Baby Charlie was a happy child who smiled at everything and everyone, bringing light to even the hardest days. The ranch prospered in ways Nathan and Delilah had hardly dared to dream of in those early days. The horse training business became regionally known, with clients coming from as far as Arizona Territory and Texas to work with Nathan. They were able to expand their land holdings, buying another 50 acres when it became available, and to build a larger barn and better facilities for the horses. But despite the success and the busyness of life with 3 children and a business, Nathan and Delilah always made time for each other. They maintained their Sunday afternoon rides whenever possible, now with children in tow, showing Thomas and Sarah and Charlie the same hidden valleys and clear streams where Nathan had courted Delilah years ago. They made sure to sit together on the porch most evenings after the children were in bed, holding hands and talking about the day and making plans for the future. Delilah never forgot where she had come from or how close she had come to disaster. She kept her mother's locket in a place of honor on her dresser when she was not wearing it, and she told her children the story of how their father had bought it at an auction to save it for her, and had returned it on their wedding day. She wanted them to understand the value of compassion and kindness, of seeing someone in need and choosing to help even when it was not easy or convenient. Nathan, for his part, never forgot the fear and desperation he had seen in Delilah's eyes that day at the auction. It drove him to be successful not just for his own pride, but because he wanted to ensure she never felt that vulnerable again. He wanted her to feel safe and secure and valued, and he worked every day to make sure she knew how much she meant to him. In 1890, when Thomas was 9, Sarah was 8, and Charlie was 5, Nathan and Delilah celebrated their 11th wedding anniversary with a return trip to Tucumcari. They left the children with a neighbor couple for the weekend and rode into town together, staying at the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, who was now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack. They visited the church where they had been married and stood in the cemetery where Delilah's parents were buried. Nathan stood slightly behind Delilah with his hands on her shoulders while she talked quietly to the graves, telling her parents about their grandchildren and the life she had built and how happy she was. There were tears, but they were gentle tears, the kind that came from remembering love rather than mourning loss. They also went to the place where the auction had been held 11 years earlier. The street looked different now, with new buildings and more people, the signs of a town that was growing and prospering. But Delilah could still picture exactly where she had stood, where Carver had held up the locket, where Nathan had called out his bid from the back of the crowd. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had not been there that day," Delilah said, leaning back against Nathan's solid warmth. "Where would I be now? What would have become of me?" "You would have found a way," Nathan said with certainty. "You are strong and smart and determined. You would have survived somehow, even without me." "Maybe," Delilah allowed, "but I am so grateful I did not have to find out. I am so grateful you were there, that you cared enough to help a stranger, that you saw something in me worth saving." "I saw everything worth saving," Nathan said softly. "I saw courage and dignity and beauty, even in the midst of your worst moment. I saw the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, even if I did not fully realize it at the time." They stood there for a long time, remembering and reflecting, before finally walking back to the boarding house hand in hand. That night, lying in bed in a room that was not so different from the one Delilah had occupied 11 years ago when she had been alone and frightened, they made love with the tenderness and passion of two people who knew exactly how lucky they were to have found each other. The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas grew into a studious young man who went to school in Santa Fe and then returned to help his father with the horse training business, bringing new ideas and energy to the work. Sarah shocked everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher, and Nathan and Delilah supported her ambition wholeheartedly, helping her attend a teaching college in Albuquerque. Charlie proved to have his father's gift with horses and his mother's kind heart, and by the time he was 18, he was doing most of the day-to-day training work alongside Thomas. In 1898, when Delilah was 40 years old and Nathan was 44, they became grandparents for the first time when Thomas married a quiet schoolteacher named Elizabeth and had a daughter they named Delilah in honor of her grandmother. Holding baby Delilah for the first time, feeling the weight of a new generation in her arms, filled the original Delilah with overwhelming emotion. She thought about how far she had come from that desperate girl selling her mother's locket in a dusty street, and she marveled at the grace that had brought her to this moment. Nathan was a devoted grandfather, just as gentle and patient with baby Delilah as he had been with his own children. He carved toys and told stories, and could be found more often than not with the baby sleeping on his chest, while he sat on the porch he had built so many years ago. More grandchildren followed over the years. Thomas and Elizabeth had 2 more children. Sarah married a lawyer from Santa Fe and had 3 children of her own, and Charlie eventually married a rancher's daughter from the next county over and started a family as well. The house that Nathan had built became too small for all the family gatherings, so they added on, creating more rooms and a larger porch where everyone could gather on Sundays and holidays. Through it all, through the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that made up a life, Nathan and Delilah remained devoted to each other. They grew older together, their hair turning gray and lines deepening on their faces, but the love between them only grew stronger with each passing year. They had weathered hard times together, celebrated good times together, and built something that would last beyond their own lives in the children and grandchildren who carried their love forward. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, their children threw them a celebration at the ranch. Nearly 100 people attended, including grandchildren and friends and people whose horses Nathan had trained over the decades, and families Delilah had helped in various ways over the years. There was food and music and dancing, and speech after speech praising the couple and the life they had built together. Late in the evening, when the party was winding down and the grandchildren were being put to bed by their parents, Nathan took Delilah's hand and led her away from the crowd to a quiet spot where they could be alone. The New Mexico sky stretched above them, vast and filled with stars just as it had been that first night after their wedding 30 years ago. "I have something for you," Nathan said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet. "I know we said we would not do gifts since the children did this whole party, but I wanted to give you something. Look closely at it." Delilah took the bracelet and examined it in the starlight. It was beautifully made, with intricate engravings along its length, and as she looked closer she realized the engravings were tiny images. A locket, a horse, a house, small figures that represented their children. It was the story of their life together, told in silver. "Nathan," she breathed, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and beauty of it. "This is incredible. How did you even think of this?" "I have been planning it for months," Nathan admitted. "I wanted to give you something that would remind you of everything we have built together, all the moments and memories that have made our life. But mostly I wanted to remind you that it all started with a locket, and with the luckiest day of my life when I saw you standing in that street and knew I had to help you." "The luckiest day of my life, too," Delilah said, her voice thick with emotion, "even though it did not feel lucky at the time." Nathan fastened the bracelet around her wrist, then raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times over 30 years of marriage. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from the first moment I saw you, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Delilah replied, touching his face tenderly. "You saved me, Nathan. You gave me everything." "You saved me right back," Nathan said. "You gave me purpose and love and a family, and a reason to get up every morning grateful to be alive. We saved each other." They stood together under the stars, these two people who had found each other in the midst of hardship and had chosen each other every day since. Around Delilah's wrist, the silver bracelet gleamed in the starlight, a reminder of all they had been through and all they had built. And in her jewelry box inside the house, carefully preserved, lay a silver locket that had been sold and returned, and had witnessed the beginning of a love story that would be told to children and grandchildren for generations to come. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes and challenges of life. Nathan and Delilah grew older, slowing down but never losing the essential connection that bound them together. They handed over more and more of the ranch work to their sons, content to take a supervisory role and to spend their days surrounded by family. In 1920, when Delilah was 62 and Nathan was 66, they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary with just each other, sitting on their porch as the sun set over the mountains they had looked at together for so many years. Their children were grown with families of their own, their grandchildren were thriving, and they had built a legacy that would last long after they were gone. If you could go back and change anything, would you? Nathan asked, his voice a bit rougher with age but still the same deep rumble that had first caught Delilah's attention in a crowded street so long ago. Delilah thought about it seriously, considering the question. She thought about the pain of losing her parents, the desperation of the auction, the hard work and uncertainty of those early days. But she also thought about everything that had come from those difficult times. Nathan, their children, the life they had built together. "No," she said finally. "I would not change a thing. Every moment, even the hard ones, led me to you and to this life. And I would live through all of it again if it meant ending up right here, right now with you." Nathan squeezed her hand gently. "Good answer." "Because I would not change anything either, except maybe to have found you sooner so we could have had even more years together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky change colors. Two people who had lived a full and meaningful life together, and were content in the knowledge that they had loved well and been loved in return. Around Delilah's neck, as it was most days now, hung the silver locket that had started it all, a tangible reminder of the moment a cowboy with kind eyes had chosen to help a desperate young woman and had changed both their lives forever. When Nathan passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1923 at the age of 69, Delilah mourned him deeply, but without regret. They had been given 44 years together, more than many couples could hope for, and they had filled those years with love and purpose. At his funeral, attended by what seemed like half the territory, Delilah wore the locket and the bracelet he had given her, and she stood straight and proud, honoring the man who had been her rescuer, her husband, her partner, and her truest love. She lived another 12 years after Nathan died, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the legacy of love and kindness that Nathan and Delilah had built together. She spent her final years telling stories to anyone who would listen, making sure the next generations understood where they had come from and what their grandparents had overcome to build the life they all enjoyed. When Delilah died in 1935 at the age of 77, her children found her in her bedroom, dressed in her best dress with the silver locket around her neck and the silver bracelet on her wrist, looking peaceful and almost young again, as though she had simply stepped out of her aging body and back into the time when she was 20 and in love for the first time. They buried her next to Nathan on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together, with headstones that bore both their names and a simple inscription chosen by their children. They saved each other. The silver locket passed to the granddaughter who had been named after Delilah, and with it came the story of how a cowboy bought it at an auction to save it for the woman he would love for the rest of his life, and how he returned it to her on their wedding day as a symbol of his promise to protect her always. The story was told and retold, embellished slightly with each generation but always maintaining its essential truth. That love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that kindness matters more than wealth, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the beginning of our best ones. The ranch that Nathan and Delilah built together remained in the family for generations, passed down from parents to children to grandchildren, a living testament to what two people could create when they chose to love each other fully and build a life together with patience and determination and faith in the future. And visitors to the ranch, seeing the old photographs and hearing the stories, would marvel at how it all began with a simple silver locket sold at an auction and bought by a cowboy who saw a desperate young woman and decided to help, never knowing that this single act of kindness would become the foundation of a love story that would last through the ages and inspire everyone who heard it to believe in the power of compassion and the enduring strength of true love.